The war was not misunderstood. That is the first thing to accept. The idea that Vietnam was a tragedy born of confusion, of good intentions colliding with impossible terrain, of American idealism broken against the reality of Southeast Asian politics. That framing is itself a form of protection. It protects institutions. It protects careers. It protects the men who sat in air-conditioned offices in Saigon and Washington and moved units around maps like the map was the war. The confusion was not accidental. It was manufactured, sustained, and then exported to the public as the only available explanation for why things went the way they went. What actually happened in Vietnam was not a failure of understanding. It was a failure of honesty, and that failure was deliberate from almost the very beginning. This is not a story about brave soldiers who deserved better leadership, though many of them did. It is not a story about a noble cause corrupted by politics, though politics corrupted nearly everything it touched. It is a story about how a modern bureaucratic military machine attached to a democratic government that needed the appearance of progress slowly replaced reality with paperwork, and how the men who lived inside that replacement, the soldiers on the ground, the officers in the field, the advisors embedded with South Vietnamese units, had to find ways to survive not just the enemy, but the institution they served. Begin with the simplest fact. By 1967, the United States military was running a war in which the primary metric of success was the body count, not territory held, not population secured, not political stability achieved. Bodies, enemy bodies, specifically, though the definition of enemy was flexible enough to accommodate almost anyone who died in an area where the enemy might have been. The logic behind this metric was deceptively clean. If you killed enough of the enemy, eventually there would not be enough of them left to fight. It was a war of attrition, and attrition could be measured. You could put a number on it. You could brief it to a congressman. You could present it to a president who wanted to know whether we were winning. The problem was that the numbers were not real, not entirely, not even mostly in some cases. The pressure to produce favorable body counts flowed downward through every level of command with the same force as the pressure to produce favorable earnings reports flows through a corporation. A battalion commander who reported low numbers looked like a man who was not fighting hard enough. A company commander who came back from an operation with nothing to show risked being seen as cautious, ineffective, or worse. So numbers were inflated. They were estimated upward. Civilians killed in firefights were counted as combatants. Dead bodies found in areas that had been bombed days earlier were added to the tally as if they had just been killed. Weapons were borrowed, photographed alongside bodies, and returned to the armory so they could be used again in the next report. None of this was secret inside the units where it happened. The soldiers knew, the sergeants knew, most of the junior officers knew. What they did not know and could not have known was the scale, how far up the chain this practice extended, how thoroughly the reports that reached the Pentagon had been laundered through successive levels of optimistic revision. General William Westmoreland, who commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, genuinely believed, or chose to believe, that the numbers supported the conclusion that the enemy was being ground down. His staff fed him reports that confirmed this. The reports were built on data that had been shaped to confirm it. The circularity of this system was almost elegant in its dysfunction. The soldiers who arrived in Vietnam in the mid-1960s had been trained for a different kind of war. They had been trained for the European theater, for set-piece battles against a conventional enemy who wore a uniform and held a line. Vietnam offered none of that. The enemy moved at night, planted mines during the day, and disappeared into a population that was impossible to distinguish from them with any reliability. A village that seemed quiet in the morning might have had Viet Cong infrastructure running through it for years. The farmer who waved at the patrol had 3 sons, and 2 of them were fighters. This was not a failure of intelligence. It was the nature of the conflict. The war the United States was fighting was not the war its military was built to fight. So soldiers adapted. They adapted in ways that their training did not cover, and their officers often could not acknowledge. The first adaptation was to stop trusting the official picture of what was happening. A unit that had been told an area was secure and then walked into a minefield learned quickly to discount official assessments. A platoon that called in coordinates for an airstrike and then waited 4 hours for it to arrive, if it arrived at all, learned to plan as though support was optional. The institutional reliability that was supposed to underpin every operation had gaps in it that only became visible from the ground. The second adaptation was more corrosive. Soldiers learned to perform the war as much as fight it. They learned what the reports needed to say, and they learned how to make the operations produce those reports. This was not universal. There were units that fought with extraordinary discipline and genuine commitment to their mission, and there were officers who refused to inflate their numbers regardless of the pressure they received. But the system rewarded performance and punished honest reporting often enough that the performance became a standard practice. A unit would move through an area, make contact with the enemy or not, come back with whatever numbers were expected of them, and file the paperwork. The war on paper and the war on the ground were two separate things that occasionally overlapped. The Marines in Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam, saw some of the heaviest and most sustained fighting of the entire conflict. Places like Khe Sanh, Hue, the DMZ approaches, the Quai Son Valley, these were not symbolic engagements. They were grinding, extended operations against North Vietnamese Army regulars who were well-equipped, well-disciplined, and operating on interior lines in terrain they understood completely. The Marines who fought in these areas were not fighting a shadow. They were fighting an army, and the official reports of those battles were accurate in some of their details and wildly distorted in their conclusions. Khe Sanh is a useful example because it is one of the few Vietnam battles that most Americans have heard of. The 77-day siege that began in January 1968 produced thousands of hours of television coverage, extensive newspaper reporting, and a level of public attention that most of the war's smaller, deadlier engagements never received. The official position for most of the siege was that Khe Sanh was a strategic asset that the United States was defending successfully. The North Vietnamese were being drawn into a killing ground where American firepower could destroy them at acceptable cost. This was the framing Westmoreland offered to the press, to the Congress, and to the President. What the Marines inside the wire knew was something different. They knew that the base was surrounded, that the resupply was precarious, that the incoming artillery and mortar fire was destroying equipment and killing men on a daily basis, and that the strategic significance of holding the base was never clearly explained to them. They dug in and they fought because that is what soldiers do. They maintained their positions under conditions that would have broken a lesser force, but the certainty that was being projected from Saigon and Washington, the confidence that this was all going according to plan, did not reach the men on the perimeter. They were not confident. They were enduring. When Tet happened, in the early morning hours of January 31st, 1968, the gap between the official version of the war and the actual version became briefly, catastrophically visible to the American public. The Tet offensive was a coordinated series of attacks against more than 100 cities and military installations across South Vietnam. It hit during the Vietnamese New Year, during a period when American and South Vietnamese commanders had been told their own intelligence suggested a period of reduced enemy activity. The attacks failed militarily, in the sense that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces did not hold the cities they attacked and suffered catastrophic losses in the attempt. The official military assessment after Tet was that it represented a decisive defeat for the enemy. But the American public had just watched a few dozen North Vietnamese soldiers fight their way into the United States Embassy compound in Saigon. They had watched the chief of the South Vietnamese National Police execute a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street in front of a news camera. They had watched cities that were supposed to be secure become battlegrounds, and they had been told, repeatedly for years, that the war was going well. The credibility gap, the distance between what the government said and what people could see, did not open during Tet. Tet simply made it impossible to pretend the gap did not exist. What almost no one talked about in the aftermath of Tet, and what military historians have spent decades reconstructing, is what the intelligence failure actually looked like from the inside. There were analysts, both in Vietnam and in Washington, who had been watching the buildup of enemy forces and supply movements for months before Tet. There were reports that suggested something large was being planned. Some of those reports were forwarded up the chain. Some of them were discounted because they did not fit the prevailing assessment. Some were simply buried in the volume of intelligence traffic that passed through headquarters every day. The specific failure of Tet was not that no one saw it coming. It was that the institution was structured in a way that made it very difficult for bad news to reach the people who needed to hear it in time to act on it. That structural problem was not unique to the intelligence community. It ran through every part of the American enterprise in Vietnam. The advisory system, through which American military officers were embedded with South Vietnamese units to train and support them, was producing reports for years that documented the limitations of ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Reports that described units that would not fight, commanders who had bought their commissions and had no intention of risking them in combat, soldiers who were poorly fed and unpaid and therefore unreliable. These reports existed. They were filed. They went somewhere in the system, and simultaneously at higher levels of command, reports were being produced that described ARVN's growing effectiveness, its improving capabilities, its increasingly central role in the defense of its own country. Both sets of reports reflected something real. There were South Vietnamese units that fought with courage and skill under commanders who led from the front. There were also South Vietnamese units that existed largely on paper, their rosters padded with ghost soldiers whose pay was collected by their officers. Both things were true. What the system needed, for political and strategic reasons, was the former version. So the former version was amplified and the latter was minimized, and the picture that reached Washington was a picture of an ally that was steadily improving, that would one day be capable of defending itself without American combat troops. This fiction, and it was a fiction, not a hope, by the mid-1960s, became the foundation of Vietnamization under Nixon. Vietnamization was the policy of gradually withdrawing American troops, while transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. It was a politically necessary policy because the American public had turned against the war and the draft was creating domestic instability. It was also a policy built on the same optimistic distortions that had sustained the American commitment in the first place. The same system that had been reporting ARVN's growing effectiveness for years was now asked to assess whether ARVN was ready for expanded responsibility. The assessment, predictably, was that it was. The soldiers who served alongside ARVN units during Vietnamization knew the truth in their bones. Some South Vietnamese soldiers were exceptional. Some units fought hard. But the systemic problems, the corruption, the poor logistics, the politicized officer corps, the lack of a coherent national narrative that could motivate men to die for their country, those problems did not disappear because an American president needed them to. The American advisors who filed honest reports about what they were seeing were sometimes praised for their candor, and more often quietly reassigned or simply ignored. The system did not want honest reports. It wanted confirmation. The Phoenix program is one of the most documented and least understood aspects of the Vietnam War. It was a joint American-South Vietnamese initiative designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure. The political organizers, the tax collectors, the village-level administrators who sustained the insurgency below the level of armed combat. Neutralization could mean capture, defection, or death. The program ran from roughly 1967 to 1972 and produced extraordinary amounts of paperwork documenting its results. What the paperwork showed, at the macro level, was impressive. Tens of thousands of Viet Cong infrastructure members neutralized, defections in large numbers, the enemy's political apparatus disrupted across multiple provinces. What the paperwork did not show, because paperwork never shows these things, was how the numbers were produced. Provincial quota systems created incentives to find infrastructure members whether they existed or not. Local South Vietnamese officials with personal grudges could accuse neighbors of VC affiliation and find their accusations accepted without independent verification. People were killed or imprisoned on evidence that would not have passed any legal standard because legal standards were not the operational standard. The operational standard was the number, and the number had to be met. This is not to say that Phoenix was entirely corrupt or entirely ineffective. There is credible evidence that the program did disrupt genuine Viet Cong political networks in certain provinces, and that it contributed to the military weakness the VC demonstrated after 1968. There is also credible evidence of arbitrary detention, torture, and extrajudicial killing conducted under Phoenix's administrative umbrella. Both things were real. The problem is that the official record of Phoenix made the first thing visible and made the second thing very hard to find. The program's architects and defenders could point to the numbers. The critics could point to specific cases. The specific cases were always dismissed as aberrations. The numbers were always presented as the summary of the truth. Air power occupied a special place in the mythology and the reality of the Vietnam War. The United States dropped more bombs on Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia combined than it dropped on all targets during the entirety of World War II. This is not a rhetorical figure. It is a number that has been confirmed by official records. The sheer volume of ordnance expended was staggering, and the strategic logic behind it evolved and contracted over the course of the war in ways that suggested the strategy was never fully formed to begin with. The bombing of North Vietnam under Operation Rolling Thunder, which ran from 1965 to 1968, was designed to do several things simultaneously, and the fact that it was designed to do several things simultaneously was itself a problem. It was supposed to interdict the supply lines running south from North Vietnam into the south. It was supposed to impose economic costs on North Vietnam that would erode its will to fight. It was supposed to signal American resolve to Hanoi and encourage them to negotiate on terms favorable to the United States and South Vietnam. It achieved none of these objectives fully, and the evidence that it was failing to achieve them was visible to analysts who were watching the right indicators. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the primary supply route from north to south, was bombed continuously and persistently. Bridges were rebuilt within days of being destroyed. Alternative routes were opened when primary routes were closed. The North Vietnamese developed an extraordinary logistics system based on human and bicycle carriers that was almost immune to air interdiction because it dispersed the target set into thousands of individual loads that could be moved at night and hidden during the day. American pilots flew mission after mission against a target that reconstituted itself as fast as it was hit. The bomb damage assessment reports, the documents that were supposed to evaluate whether the bombing was achieving its objectives, were chronically optimistic. Assessors were under the same institutional pressure as everyone else in the system. The men who flew those missions were not bureaucrats. They were professional aviators operating in some of the most demanding conditions combat aviation has ever produced. North Vietnamese air defenses improved dramatically through the course of Rolling Thunder, incorporating Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles that required constant tactical adaptation. American pilots were lost at a rate that the Air Force and Navy could not sustain indefinitely, and they flew their missions knowing, at some level, that the targets they were hitting were not deciding the war. They hit the same bridge 17 times. They watched it rebuilt. They hit it again. The rules of engagement that governed American air operations in Vietnam were a source of constant frustration for the pilots and planners who operated under them. Political considerations in Washington translated into targeting restrictions that made tactical sense difficult to achieve. Certain targets near Hanoi and Haiphong were off-limits because of concern about killing Soviet or Chinese advisors, or because striking them might precipitate a broader escalation that the administration was desperate to avoid. The logic behind the restrictions was not irrational from a strategic standpoint, but it meant that the war was being fought with one hand partially tied, and that fact was known to the men doing the fighting while it was obscured in the public presentation of the campaign. What almost no one in the American public knew during Rolling Thunder was the extent to which some of the most important targeting decisions were being made in the White House rather than the Pentagon. President Johnson personally reviewed strike packages for Hanoi area targets on Tuesday lunches with his closest advisors. The President of the United States was choosing which oil tanks and which bridges would be hit on a given week. Military commanders found this extraordinary and not in a good way. They believed, and they were not wrong, that targeting decisions should be made by people who understood the tactical and operational context, not by political figures managing escalation thresholds from thousands of miles away. But Johnson was terrified of escalation. He was terrified that striking the wrong target would bring China into the war the way China had come into Korea. So he managed the bombing personally, and the bombing was managed in a way that prioritized political caution over military effectiveness, and the war ground on. The ground war in the South produced its own parallel universe of institutional denial and operational reality. Search and destroy was the primary tactical doctrine of American ground forces through most of the Westmoreland era. Units would be lifted into areas of suspected enemy activity. They would move through the terrain looking for contact. They would engage whatever they found. They would count the bodies, and they would be extracted. The idea was to keep constant pressure on the enemy, to deny them safe areas, to force them to fight and be attrited. In practice, the enemy chose when to fight. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong held the tactical initiative in most of the country most of the time because they knew the terrain and they chose the moment of contact. American firepower was overwhelming when contact was made. The problem was that contact happened on the enemy's terms. The soldiers who lived this reality developed their own language for it. A walk in the sun was a patrol that went out and came back without finding anything. A meeting engagement was what happened when you stumbled into the enemy before he was ready for you. A hammer and anvil was the theory. You drove the enemy into a blocking force, but the reality was that the enemy usually knew where the blocking force was and simply did not go in that direction. The operational concepts were clear on paper. On the ground, they were contested by a force that had 20 years of experience fighting in that specific terrain and understood the doctrine it was facing. The tunnels of Cu Chi represent one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the Vietnam War, and also one of the most persistent institutional embarrassments for American commanders who had to explain why they could not secure an area 20 miles northwest of Saigon. The tunnel system beneath Cu Chi District began as a French-era construction and was expanded and refined over decades of conflict into an underground city with multiple levels, ventilation systems, hospitals, command centers, weapons workshops, and living quarters capable of housing thousands of people. American forces operated above these tunnels for years without fully understanding what was underneath them. Villages that were searched in the daytime were occupied at night by Viet Cong fighters who came up from below. The tunnel rats, the small soldiers who volunteered or were assigned to go into the tunnels to clear them, operated in conditions that defy easy description. They crawled through passages wide enough for a Vietnamese body with a pistol and a flashlight, sometimes a knife, knowing that at any turn they might meet someone coming the other way. The psychological preparation required for this work was not something the army officially trained. The men who did it developed their own protocols, their own unit cultures, their own understanding of what could and could not be done underground. The official reports of tunnel clearing operations described results. Enemy killed, documents captured, supplies destroyed. What the reports did not capture was the essential improvisation of the work, the degree to which every tunnel entry was a unique problem solved by whoever was in the hole. The war produced its own category of documentation problem when it came to civilian casualties. From the beginning, there were structural incentives to not count civilian deaths, and where they were counted, to misclassify them. Any Vietnamese civilian killed in a free fire zone was classified as a combatant by the zone designation itself. Any Vietnamese civilian killed in an airstrike was invisible in the bomb damage assessment report, which counted damage to structures and infrastructure rather than people. Any Vietnamese civilian killed in an artillery mission was accounted for in the protocol that authorized the mission. If the protocol said the area was clear of friendly forces, then whoever died there was presumed to be enemy. The civilian casualty problem was not a secret within the military. There were officers who raised concerns about it through official channels. Medical units who treated Vietnamese civilians knew what the wounds looked like and knew they were coming from American or South Vietnamese fire. Province senior advisors who dealt with local populations regularly had to manage the political consequences of civilian deaths caused by operations that were supposedly protecting those populations. The feedback existed. It circulated, and at each level of the command structure, it was assessed against the operational imperative of the ongoing mission and generally found to be a manageable cost. My Lai is the name that entered the public record. The massacre in March 1968, when soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry killed somewhere between 300 and 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in a village in Quang Ngai Province. It became public knowledge more than a year after it happened, through the persistent investigative work of a journalist named Seymour Hersh, who had been tipped by a soldier trying to get someone to pay attention. The Army's initial investigation had concluded there was nothing to investigate. The cover-up was not particularly sophisticated. It relied on the institutional assumption that what happened in the field stayed in the field, and that reporters did not have access to the soldiers who had been there. What made My Lai significant beyond its immediate horror was what its exposure revealed about the institutional context in which it occurred. The soldiers who participated were not sociopaths selected for violence. They were drafted men and volunteers who had been through military training and had spent months in a war zone being shot at, watching their friends hit mines, receiving intelligence of dubious quality, and operating under commanders who had measured their performance by body count. The specific pathology of My Lai was not random. It grew from a specific set of institutional pressures and cultural distortions that had been building for years. The question that got very little official examination was not whether Lieutenant William Calley was guilty. He was. The question was what the chain of command above Calley knew, and when. The investigation that followed, eventually conducted by the Army under General William Peers, was remarkable in the breadth of what it found and in the narrowness of what it prosecuted. The Peers Commission documented a cover-up that ran through multiple levels of command. It found that information about the killings had reached senior officers and had been suppressed. It identified numerous individuals who had knowledge of what happened and had not reported it or had actively participated in concealing it. The Commission recommended charges against 14 officers. Eventually, Calley was the only person convicted. He served 3 years under house arrest before his sentence was commuted. The soldiers who returned from Vietnam did not come home to a coherent national narrative about what they had done and what had been done to them. This is well documented in the literature about Vietnam veterans, but its full weight is sometimes lost in the familiar story of protesters spitting on veterans at airports, which appears to be largely mythological, and the less dramatic but more pervasive story of simple silence. Veterans came back and discovered that the war they had fought was one that the country did not know how to talk about. There were no victory parades, because there was no victory. There was no clear enemy against whom the sacrifice could be measured. There was a casualty list and a body count and a gradual, negotiated withdrawal and then, eventually, the fall of Saigon. The psychological consequences of Vietnam service were observed, but not acknowledged for years. Post-traumatic stress disorder did not enter the diagnostic and statistical manual until 1980, after Vietnam veterans and the clinicians who worked with them had spent years making the case that the syndrome was real and specific and treatable. Before that, the men who came back with nightmares and hypervigilance and an inability to hold employment or relationships were diagnosed with character disorders or substance abuse problems, or simply told they needed to pull themselves together. The institutional resistance to recognizing combat trauma was not accidental. Acknowledging that the war had broken a significant portion of the men who fought it, would have required acknowledging what the war had been. The drug problem in Vietnam is one of the most consistently documented and consistently minimized aspects of the conflict. By the early 1970s, heroin was available in the cities and villages around American bases with a purity and at a price that defied easy analogy. The estimates of American soldiers who used heroin during their tours range widely depending on the study and the definition used, but the number was large enough that the Army eventually implemented a mandatory urine testing program before soldiers could return to the United States. The program found what everyone already suspected. It also created its own institutional complications, because soldiers who tested positive were kept in country for treatment programs that the Army had not fully developed and could not fully staff. Marijuana use was widespread throughout the war, from the early advisory years through the final withdrawal. It was used by soldiers at every rank below the senior officer level, in units that were effective and in units that were not, in the rear areas and in the field. The official position was that it was a disciplinary problem to be addressed by courts-martial and administrative action. The operational reality was that it was pervasive enough that suppressing it would have required measures that would have further degraded morale in a force whose morale was already a serious concern. So it was prosecuted selectively and ignored systemically, and the gap between the official position and the operational reality became another layer of institutional dishonesty that soldiers navigated daily. The fragging phenomenon, the killing or attempted killing of officers and NCOs by enlisted soldiers using fragmentation grenades or other weapons, peaked in the early 1970s as the withdrawal drew down the force, and the remaining soldiers faced the specific futility of fighting and dying in a war that everyone knew was ending. The Army's statistics on fragging incidents are known to be incomplete because many incidents were reported as accidents or enemy action. The incidents that were definitively identified as fraggings numbered in the hundreds across the war, with a spike in 1970 and 1971. They targeted officers and NCOs who were seen as too aggressive in pushing their men into dangerous situations that no longer had any strategic purpose, or who were seen as indifferent to their men's welfare, or who were informants about drug use. Fragging became a form of violent labor negotiation in a workforce that had no other recourse. Men who had been drafted into a war they did not understand, who had watched their friends die for objectives that dissolved as soon as they were stated, who were being asked to conduct aggressive operations in the final years of American involvement when the political decision to withdraw had already been made. These men sometimes decided they would not go, and sometimes, when the man who was making them go had a grenade thrown through his hooch window, the Army prosecuted what it could prove. It could not prove most of what it suspected. And the culture of the short-timers' war, in which survival to the end of your tour was the only real objective, made institutional loyalty to dead abstractions essentially impossible to enforce. The Cambodian incursion of 1970 is an example of how the gap between strategic presentation and operational reality could widen dramatically in a very short time. Nixon announced it as a limited operation to destroy the North Vietnamese military headquarters for South Vietnam, COSVN, Central Office for South Vietnam, which American intelligence believed was located in the Cambodian sanctuaries. The operation was presented as a decisive stroke that would disrupt enemy supply and command structures and buy time for Vietnamization. It produced significant quantities of captured weapons, ammunition, and supplies. It did not capture or destroy COSVN because COSVN was not a fixed headquarters in the conventional sense. It was a dispersed command structure that moved when threatened and reformed after the threat passed. The soldiers who crossed into Cambodia found exactly what they had been told they would find: supply caches, base camps, weapons storage. They did not find the decisive blow that the political presentation had promised. They found a logistic system they could disrupt but not destroy. And when the operation ended and American forces withdrew back into Vietnam, the North Vietnamese returned to their sanctuaries and rebuilt what had been destroyed. The operational logic of the incursion was real but limited. The political logic of the announcement, the certainty, the decisiveness, the language of a turning point, had no relationship to what the soldiers on the ground experienced. The Laotian operation of 1971, Lam Son 719, was Vietnamization's most visible test before the final collapse. The concept was straightforward and ambitious. South Vietnamese ground forces, without American ground support, would attack into Laos along Route 9 and destroy the North Vietnamese base areas and supply infrastructure in the Laos Panhandle. American air power would provide close air support, airlift, and logistics. The operation would demonstrate that ARVN could conduct independent combined arms operations and that Vietnamization had produced a capable fighting force. The operation was a catastrophe. South Vietnamese forces advanced into Laos and encountered North Vietnamese resistance that was far heavier and better organized than the planning assumptions had allowed for. Units that stalled called for extraction. Some soldiers clung to the skids of American helicopters to get out. The operation ended with South Vietnamese forces withdrawing under fire, having taken substantial casualties and having failed to achieve most of their objectives. American news cameras filmed South Vietnamese soldiers hanging from helicopter skids. The official assessment from Saigon and Washington described Lam Son 719 as a qualified success that had disrupted enemy supply lines and demonstrated ARVN's willingness to fight. The gap between the assessment and the footage was visible to anyone who watched the evening news. The media coverage of Vietnam underwent its own evolution over the course of the war that is often simplified in retrospect. The early years of major American involvement saw coverage that was largely sympathetic to the American effort, conducted by journalists who operated with considerable access to military operations and who shared broadly the Cold War assumptions of the institutions they were covering. The shift in tone came gradually, driven by the accumulating contradiction between what official sources were saying and what reporters were seeing. The credibility gap was not created by hostile journalism. It was created by officials who made claims that the evidence did not support, and reporters who eventually stopped treating official claims as the last word. The reporters who covered the ground war, who went out with units, who were in Hue during the battle, who were at Khe Sanh during the siege, were writing about something different from the reporters who attended briefings at MACV headquarters in Saigon. The daily briefings at MACV became known among the press corps as the 5 o'clock follies because of the consistent disconnect between what was being briefed and what reporters had seen in the field that same day. The military's public affairs apparatus was not lying exactly. It was selecting, framing, and contextualizing in ways that consistently emphasized favorable indicators and minimized unfavorable ones. This is not unique to the Vietnam War, but the scale of the gap between the briefings and reality, sustained over years, eventually made the briefings useful primarily as documents of institutional self-deception. The sailors aboard aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin and the South China Sea had a particular kind of access to the war's institutional machinery that most soldiers did not. They saw the sorties launched, and they saw the aircraft return, and they counted the ordnance expended and logged the missions completed. What they could not see was whether any of it mattered. The strike packages went out, the bombs fell, the aircraft came back, minus the ones that did not come back. And the next day, the same targets were often back on the list. The ordnance techs who armed the aircraft every morning were doing the same job they had done the morning before, against the same target sets they had been working against for months. The institutional logic was there. The strategic outcome was not. Prisoners of war held in North Vietnam existed in a liminal space in American public consciousness that was carefully managed by both sides. The North Vietnamese used American prisoners as political assets, occasionally displaying them to sympathetic visitors and using their statements, coerced or otherwise, in propaganda. The American military wanted to keep the prisoner issue from becoming a public debate while the war was ongoing, because public focus on prisoners created pressure for negotiations on terms the administration did not want to accept. The families of prisoners were essentially asked to be patient and quiet, and most of them were, because they understood or were made to understand that public pressure might make things worse for their men. What the prisoners themselves went through, the torture, the extended isolation, the psychological manipulation, the years of uncertainty, became public knowledge slowly and incompletely. The accounts that emerged after the war described a system of coercion that was systematic and prolonged. Men who had been trained to resist interrogation found the limits of their resistance over days and weeks and months. Men who provided information under torture spent years afterward uncertain what they had done and what it had cost. The institutional American response was to treat the POWs as heroes, which many of them were, in a way that honored the suffering without fully examining the institution that had put them in the position to suffer. The defoliation program, primarily using Agent Orange, was one of the most significant environmental and health catastrophes associated with the Vietnam War, and it was one of the most persistently denied for the longest period after the war ended. The program was designed to strip the jungle canopy that provided cover for enemy movement and to destroy crops in areas that supported the insurgency. Between 1961 and 1971, the United States sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Agent Orange, which contained dioxin as a contaminant, was sprayed extensively across the country. The health consequences for Vietnamese civilians exposed to Agent Orange were severe and multi-generational. The rates of certain cancers, of birth defects, of developmental disorders in communities that had been heavily sprayed were documented by Vietnamese researchers and eventually by independent international studies. The official American position for decades was that the evidence was insufficient to establish causation. The position was defensible on narrow scientific grounds because establishing direct causation in epidemiological studies is genuinely difficult. It was indefensible as a moral position given what the evidence actually showed about the scale and character of the harm. American veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange spent years fighting for recognition and compensation, while the Veterans Administration maintained that there was insufficient evidence to connect their conditions to Agent Orange exposure. The process of recognition moved slowly, driven by congressional pressure, and eventually by the accumulation of studies that could not be collectively ignored. The list of conditions presumptively associated with Agent Orange exposure grew over decades as the evidence accumulated. Each addition to the list was a concession that the earlier denials had been wrong, though the denials were never framed that way. The South Vietnamese military's own internal contradictions are rarely examined with the same attention given to American institutional failures, but they were no less significant and in many ways more fundamental. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was created in the image of the American military, trained on American doctrine, equipped with American weapons, and evaluated by American advisors using American standards. The fit between the institution and the society it was supposed to defend was imperfect at nearly every level. The officer corps of ARVN was shaped by French colonial military culture, by South Vietnamese political dynamics in which military command was a political asset and could be purchased or inherited, and by the American advisory system, which imposed its own values and expectations on an institution that had different historical foundations. The result was a force that could perform impressively in some contexts and collapse in others, whose performance could not be reliably predicted from its training records or equipment status or order of battle, because the factors that actually determined performance, leadership quality, unit cohesion, logistical reliability, the soldiers' belief in what they were fighting for, were not the factors that American assessment systems were designed to measure. The Strategic Hamlet program of the early 1960s represents one of the most complete illustrations of how the gap between American strategic theory and Vietnamese social reality could produce outcomes that were the opposite of what was intended. The program, modeled loosely on British counterinsurgency experience in Malaya, was designed to concentrate South Vietnamese rural populations in fortified hamlets from which they could be protected from Viet Cong influence, provided with government services, and organized into self-defense forces. It was administratively ambitious and politically appealing and strategically coherent on paper. In practice, it required removing peasants from the land their families had farmed for generations and forcing them into settlements they had not chosen. It required levels of administrative competence and honest implementation from South Vietnamese local officials that many of those officials did not have or chose not to provide. It required the Saigon government to deliver services and security to populations it had not previously served well. And it required this to happen fast enough and thoroughly enough to produce political loyalty before the Viet Cong could undermine the program from within. Almost none of these requirements were met consistently. Hamlets were built, reported as secure, and then abandoned when the security forces moved on. Hamlet chiefs were assassinated by the Viet Cong to demonstrate that the government could not protect them. Peasants who had been forcibly relocated harbored resentment that made them more susceptible to Viet Cong recruiting, not less. The statistics on strategic hamlets, the number completed, the populations enrolled, the percentage rated as secure, were produced by a system with strong incentives to show progress, and the statistics showed progress long after the program had functionally failed. The role of the CIA in Vietnam predated the major American military involvement by years and was more complex and in some ways more consequential than its public profile during the war suggested. Agency operations ranged from the earliest political support for Ngo Dinh Diem through the coup that led to his assassination in 1963, through the various paramilitary programs that ran alongside the conventional military effort, through the leadership of the Phoenix program and the advisors embedded with provincial reconnaissance units. The CIA's institutional culture of compartmentalization meant that different parts of the agency often had different understandings of what was happening and why, and that the information flowing to policymakers was filtered through multiple layers of analysis before it arrived. The assessments produced by the CIA's Analytical Directorate were sometimes significantly more pessimistic about the war's progress than the assessments produced by the military's own intelligence apparatus. These divergences were not always visible to policymakers because the institutional pressure to present a unified optimistic picture was strong enough that conflicting assessments were sometimes reconciled before they reached the level where they would force a decision. When dissenting analyses did reach senior officials, the officials sometimes chose to accept the more optimistic version because the pessimistic version, if accurate, implied policy consequences they were not prepared to accept. The body bag issue, the management of American war dead, and the institutional effort to control the public visibility of casualties is another example of the gap between the official face of the war and the reality being managed behind it. Casualty figures were released regularly and publicly. The weekly death toll became a fixture of American news coverage and a persistent reminder of the war's cost. What was controlled more carefully was the imagery. The Dover Air Force Base where American war dead arrived had strict rules about press access. The flag-draped coffins were not photographed if the military could prevent it. The management of this imagery was not about deception in the narrow sense. The numbers were accurate, but about controlling the emotional weight of the information so that the cumulative cost of the war was felt numerically rather than visually. The nurses and medical personnel who served in Vietnam occupied a particular position in the war's institutional structure. They were close to the human cost in ways that most others were not, and they were expected to process that cost without the institutional support structures that might have mitigated it. Field hospitals and evacuation hospitals dealt with wound patterns that had no precedent in the medical literature, because high-velocity rifle wounds and fragmentation injuries and blast injuries at close range produced tissue destruction that surgeons had not been trained to handle. The doctors and nurses adapted, developed new protocols, saved people who would not have survived any previous war, and they did it in facilities that were themselves subject to attack. In a conflict where the front was everywhere and the rear was nowhere, The experiences of nurses who served in Vietnam were largely invisible in the public narrative of the war for years. The war story was a story about men in combat, and the narrative infrastructure for other kinds of stories was not well developed. The psychological consequences for women who had held dying soldiers, who had performed triage in mass casualty events, who had worked 36-hour shifts and then been expected to function normally. These were not examined with the same attention as combat-related trauma until veterans' advocacy eventually made the conversation possible. The Montagnard people of the Central Highlands of Vietnam were caught in the war's contradictions in ways that produced tragedy that has been barely registered in the historical record outside specialist literature. The Montagnards were the indigenous highland peoples of Vietnam, ethnically and culturally distinct from the lowland Vietnamese, who had been recruited by American Special Forces from the early 1960s to fight against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, who used the highlands as transit routes and base areas. They were effective fighters with extensive knowledge of their terrain, and they formed genuine relationships with the American advisors who worked with them. The problem was that the Montagnards were also despised by many South Vietnamese officials, who regarded them as primitive and subordinate. American promises of autonomy and self-governance that were made to secure Montagnard cooperation were promises that the Saigon government had no intention of honoring. The Special Forces advisors who made those promises in the field were making promises that exceeded their authority. When American forces eventually withdrew and the Saigon government reasserted control over the highlands, the Montagnards, who had fought alongside Americans, were in a difficult position that became a catastrophic one after 1975. The relationship between the United States military and the Montagnard people, one of genuine mutual respect at the individual level and institutional betrayal at every other level, is a story that does not fit comfortably into any standard narrative about the war. The strategic significance of the Mekong Delta in South Vietnam was understood by both sides from early in the conflict. The delta was the rice basket of the country, densely populated, agriculturally rich, and honeycombed with waterways that created a terrain problem for conventional military operations and an opportunity for the small boat war that became the Navy's Brown Water mission. The mobile riverine force operated through the delta, conducting operations that were in some ways the most genuinely counterinsurgency-oriented of the American military effort. Close interaction with the population, knowledge of local conditions, the kind of slow grinding work that produced no dramatic results and therefore no prominent place in the official narrative. The pacification reports from the delta were among the most contested in Vietnam. The Hamlet evaluation system, which was the American mechanism for assessing the security status of rural hamlets across South Vietnam, produced quarterly reports that aggregated data on thousands of hamlets into percentages and categories. A hamlet was rated from A to E based on security, economic development, local government effectiveness, and other factors. The ratings drove policy and resource allocation. They also drove institutional pressure to show progress, and the men who conducted the assessments were under the same incentive structures as everyone else in the system. The systematic study of the Hamlet evaluation system, conducted by researchers both during and after the war, found persistent problems with consistency, with the criteria being applied differently by different assessors, with the data being shaped by the operational needs of the province teams who collected it. A hamlet that had just been the site of a successful civic action program would tend to be rated more favorably than a hamlet of equivalent objective security because the assessor was invested in showing the program's results. These biases were not unique to any individual. They were structural, built into the way the system worked. The war's final years produced a specific kind of institutional paralysis in which the military continued to conduct operations at significant cost, while the political decision had already been made to withdraw. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, and American combat involvement in Vietnam effectively ended. But the war continued. The ceasefire was not observed by either side in any meaningful way. The North Vietnamese continued to reinforce their positions in the South. The South Vietnamese continued to fight, now without American ground support and with declining American material support as Congress reduced funding for the South Vietnamese military. The American military advisors who remained in Vietnam after the combat withdrawal watched the situation deteriorate with the specific frustration of people who had access to information and no ability to change its implications. The reports they filed described what was happening. The reports described the loss of territory, the declining effectiveness of South Vietnamese units under resource pressure, the growing sense among South Vietnamese soldiers that they had been abandoned. These reports existed. They went through channels. And the political and institutional response was to continue the public presentation of a situation that was stabilizing and improving, while the private assessments showed something entirely different. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 was, at the operational level, a sudden and chaotic event. At the analytical level, it was the conclusion of a process that had been visible in the classified reporting for 2 years. The North Vietnamese conventional offensive that began in early 1975 moved faster than even optimistic North Vietnamese planning had expected, because South Vietnamese resistance collapsed in ways and at speeds that surprised both sides. Units that had fought well simply ceased to function when the commanders understood that no American support was coming. The psychological component of the collapse was inseparable from the material one. The evacuation of Saigon, Operation Frequent Wind, was the final official American military action in Vietnam. It was conducted by helicopter from the roof of the American embassy and from other rooftop landing zones across the city, lifting American personnel and selected South Vietnamese out of a city that was hours from North Vietnamese occupation. The images of the evacuation, the helicopters, the crowds, the people being left behind, became the visual record of the war's end in a way that the long preceding years of grinding attrition and institutional falsification did not. The end was visible. The process that led to it was largely invisible to the public that watched. The men left behind were not incidental. They were a defined category. South Vietnamese military officers, government officials, and others who had worked closely with the Americans faced a clear choice in the hours before the North Vietnamese arrived: get out or stay. Some got out, many did not. Some had been told they would be evacuated and were not. Some could not get to the evacuation points through the crowds. Some stayed because they could not bring themselves to leave their families, and bringing the entire family was not an option that the evacuation logistics supported for most people. The men who stayed and had visible associations with the American effort were sent to re-education camps, some for months, some for years, some for more than a decade. The prisoners of the re-education camps have never received the same sustained American public attention as the American POWs held in the North, though their numbers were far larger, and their conditions in many cases no less severe. This disparity is not entirely explicable by reference to American self-interest, though self-interest is part of it. It reflects a broader pattern in which the American narrative of the Vietnam War centers American experience and treats Vietnamese experience, North-South civilian military, as background context. The South Vietnamese soldiers who fought for 20 years, who lost the war, who were imprisoned by the winners, who came eventually to the United States as refugees. They existed in the American war narrative primarily as supporting characters in a story about American confusion and American trauma. The accounting for missing American servicemen became a significant political issue in the years after the war, sustained by the belief among some families and some members of Congress that American prisoners were still being held in Vietnam decades after the war's end. The intelligence community's consistent assessment was that there were no live American prisoners remaining in Vietnam, and that the remains of the missing were in many cases simply lost in the circumstances of combat, destroyed by the weapons that killed the men, scattered in areas that had subsequently been developed or flooded, or buried in unmarked locations by people who were no longer alive to say where. This assessment, despite its consistency, was not accepted by everyone who had a reason to reject it. and the prisoner and missing issue became a lens through which the war's unresolved resentments continued to focus for years. The Agent Orange litigation and the settlement reached between veterans and chemical companies in 1984 was the largest class action settlement in American history at that time. It produced compensation for some veterans while explicitly declining to establish legal liability, which was the condition the chemical companies required for settlement. The settlement meant that veterans received money and the companies did not admit they had done anything wrong. The Veterans Administration's separate process for acknowledging Agent Orange-related conditions moved on a different timeline and with different standards, creating a situation in which veterans could be receiving VA benefits for a condition while that same condition was not legally recognized as having been caused by Agent Orange. The question of what the United States military and government actually knew about the health effects of dioxin at the time the Agent Orange program was being conducted has never been fully resolved in public. The chemical companies had internal research that was not shared with the military purchasers. Military researchers had data on dioxin toxicity from laboratory studies that was available to anyone who looked. The decisions that were made about the scale and duration of the defoliation program were not made in complete ignorance of the potential risks. The question is, what weight was given to those risks against the operational benefits, and by whom, and with what level of explicit acknowledgement that there was a trade-off being made? The veterans who came home from Vietnam and eventually made their way into the VA medical system encountered an institution that was not prepared for them. The VA in the late 1960s and through the 1970s was built around the World War II generation and the Korean War generation, staffed by clinicians whose experience was primarily with physical wounds and the older cohort's particular psychological presentations. The Vietnam veterans who presented with what would later be recognized as PTSD often received diagnoses that did not fit their presentations and treatments that did not address their specific condition. The sense among many Vietnam veterans that the system did not understand what had happened to them was accurate, not paranoid. The relationship between the Vietnam War generation and the institutions that had sent them to fight and had then failed to receive them properly when they came back is one of the most complex and under-examined aspects of the war's legacy. It produced not just individual alienation, but a generational skepticism about institutional authority that shaped American politics and culture in ways that are still visible. The specific content of that skepticism, the knowledge that official statements could be systematically untrue, that the metrics of progress bore no relationship to actual progress, that the men making decisions about life and death could be wrong for years without consequence, was not abstract. It was lived. The war produced its own literature and its own visual record with a distinctive quality that sets it apart from the documentation of other American conflicts. The combination of unprecedented media access in the early years, the draft, the counterculture, and the specific disorientation of the war itself created conditions for expression that produced work of extraordinary directness. The photographs by Nick Ut and Eddie Adams, the film by Peter Davis, the memoirs by Tim O'Brien and Philip Caputo and Ron Kovich. These were not the products of a culture that had successfully metabolized its war experience. They were dispatches from an unresolved wound. The Vietnamese documentation of the war is substantially less known in the United States than the American documentation, which is itself a form of the problem. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong kept records. They analyzed their own operations, assessed their failures and their successes, and built an institutional memory that informed their conduct of the war throughout. The military history that has been produced by the Socialist Republic of Vietnam since 1975 presents the war from a perspective that is as shaped by its institutional purposes as American official history is shaped by its purposes. But the specific shapes are different, and the comparison is instructive. The Vietnamese designation of the conflict as the American War rather than the Vietnam War is not just a linguistic preference. It reflects a genuine difference in how the conflict is experienced from inside. For the Vietnamese, the period of American involvement was the latest chapter in a conflict with external powers that had been running for decades, preceded by French colonialism and Japanese occupation and the First Indochina War. The American war had specific features that distinguished it from its predecessors, primarily the scale of air power and the technology of destruction, but it fit within a pattern that Vietnamese national consciousness had been forming for a generation. The Americans, by contrast, experienced the war as an isolated event with no historical antecedents they were prepared to take seriously. The domino theory, which was the strategic justification for American involvement in Vietnam from the Eisenhower era through the Johnson escalation, did not survive the war's end in the form in which it had been presented. Vietnam fell, Cambodia fell, Laos fell. The dominoes that were supposed to fall next did not fall, or fell in ways and for reasons that had nothing to do with what happened in Vietnam. The strategic logic that had been used to justify 58,000 American deaths and the deaths of millions of Vietnamese, the logic that holding South Vietnam was essential to preventing the spread of communism through Southeast Asia and beyond, was simply wrong about the most important thing it was predicting. This fact has been processed in several ways in American strategic thinking. One processing is that it was genuinely wrong and represents a failure of strategic analysis that should inform future decisions about intervention. Another processing is that it was only wrong in the short run, that the resistance shown in Vietnam deterred further Soviet adventurism and bought time for the anti-communist states of Southeast Asia to develop economically. Another is that the theory was right but the execution was wrong, and the lesson is about how to fight, not about whether to fight. These different processings lead to different conclusions about what the war meant and what it should teach, and the debate between them has not been settled by historical consensus. What has been established by historical research is more granular and in some ways more disturbing than the strategic debate. What has been established is that the specific systems designed to measure and manage the war, the body count, the Hamlet evaluation system, the order of battle assessments, the reporting on ARVN effectiveness, were systematically producing false information, and that this falsity was known at multiple levels of the system and was not corrected because correction would have required acknowledging failure. The war was not lost because of bad luck or unlucky timing or the failure of political will at home, though political will did eventually collapse. The war was lost because the institution conducting it had built its management systems around the need to show progress rather than the need to achieve it, and by the time that distinction became impossible to hide, the political costs of honesty were too high to pay. The specific people who built and maintained those systems were not monsters. They were professionals operating within institutional incentive structures that rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. The generals who briefed optimistically did so in part because they genuinely believed the optimistic picture, and they believed it in part because the information flowing to them had been shaped by subordinates who knew what kind of information was welcome. The analysts who adjusted their assessments in the direction of official policy did so in part because they had been told by senior officials that their pessimistic assessments were not helpful, and not helpful was a powerful disincentive in an institution that wanted to help. The commanders who inflated their body counts did so in part because the alternative was to fall behind their peers in an evaluation system that used the numbers as a primary metric. The system produced the war it was designed to produce, which was a war that looked, on paper, like it was being conducted efficiently against a measurable enemy toward an achievable objective. The war in the field was different. The field war was conducted by men who had been given an unclear mission against an enemy that chose the terms of engagement in a terrain that neutralized American advantages, for a political objective that required the South Vietnamese government to be something it was not capable of becoming in the time available. The men in the field adapted to this reality. The institution above them adapted to the reporting requirements. The two adaptations diverged over time. The field reality and the institutional representation of the field reality moved apart, slowly at first, and then more quickly, until the gap was wide enough to swallow the enterprise. The Tet Offensive did not create that gap. It made the gap visible to people who had not been looking at it, and by the time it was visible, the options for closing it were all costly in ways that the institutions involved were not prepared to pay. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973. The fighting continued. The North Vietnamese built up their forces in preparation for the final offensive. The South Vietnamese military conducted operations under increasing resource constraints. Soldiers on both sides continued to die for the next 2 years in a war that had, from the American perspective, already ended. The South Vietnamese government continued to request the American support that the Paris Accords had implicitly promised and that Congress was increasingly unwilling to fund. The American military observers who remained watched the situation deteriorate with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who can see what is coming and cannot change it. Saigon fell on April 30, 1975. The last American personnel had been evacuated the previous day. The North Vietnamese army entered the city. The South Vietnamese government surrendered. The war that had cost more than 58,000 American lives, an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilian lives, between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese military deaths on both sides, and an economic cost measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, that war ended. The flag that had flown over the American embassy in Saigon was folded and taken out on one of the last helicopters. The embassy building that had been constructed to represent American permanence and commitment became, within hours, a building occupied by people the Americans had spent a decade and a half trying to stop. The last American killed in action in Vietnam died on April 29, 1975, during the final evacuation. His name was on a wall in Washington that would be dedicated 7 years later. The wall listed the names in the order they died, without rank or unit or explanation, and people came to it and pressed their fingers against the names, and the names did not answer.